This is Digital Marketing Depot, broadcasting live. I'm Karen Burka, your webinar producer. Thank you for joining us today for Onboarding, the Missing Journey. We are very pleased to welcome James Scott, General Partner at SuccessHACKER, and Margaret Wise, Vice President of Strategy at Arke. Now, before I turn the webinar over to our speakers, I want to tell all of you a couple of things. If you need some help or have a question for our speakers, just use the Q&A box, and we will do our best to help you. If you want to tell a friend, check out our sponsor, Arke, or Digital Marketing Depot. There are some widgets at the bottom of your screen. Just click on them, and they will take you where you want to go. Remember, you can customize your audience console to move or size any windows that you have open. Now, we are going to hear a lot of great content today, so I wanted to let you know we are recording this broadcast, and we will make it available for viewing on demand this afternoon. I'll send an email out when it's ready. All right, with that business taken care of, let me make some more formal introductions. James Scott is a top 100 customer success strategist and general partner at SuccessHACKER, a boutique customer success management consultancy that helps high-growth technology companies increase customer lifetime value, lower customer acquisition costs, and improve overall customer satisfaction. He has over a decade of hands-on operational experience building customer-facing organizations in subscription businesses across the U.S. and Europe. As Vice President of Strategy, Margaret Wise manages Arke's key relationships and events to facilitate the company's continued growth. She joined Arke as Senior Director of Strategic Alliances in 2014, coming from Edgewater Fullscope, a Microsoft Dynamics 365 partner. Now, audience, you can see more complete bios and contact information for our speakers on the left side of your console. Remember, if you have a question for our industry experts, please make good use of that Q&A box. I'll get to as many of those questions live after the formal presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to James Scott to get us started. James, there's your first slide.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you today on a topic that's very close to my heart. And so my role in this webinar really is to set some context and give you, talk more about the macro picture that has kind of led us to where we are today in a world where this onboarding part of the customer journey is so critical, so important. So what I want to do is just, before we get into talking about the onboarding piece itself, just take a step back and look at kind of this evolution that's happened over the last decade or so that's led us to where we are today. And I'm going to, on the screen here, you see a slide actually that I credit to Jeffrey Moore, who's the author of the famous book, Crossing the Chasm, a very good marketing book, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. He talks about how we've moved from the product era to a service era over the last decade and a half. And I'm not going to go through everything on the screen here, but I just want to sort of summarize the differences between the two. So in the product era, really everything was focused on how to optimize the supply chain and get products to customers as efficiently as possible so as to get the best possible margins. And that's not to say it's not important still today, but this was the main focus in the product era because there was more demand than supply, right? Because it was expensive to switch between different product providers. There weren't very many companies competing for the same customer base, so there was less selection for customers, and really it was all about how do the vendors get their products to customers as efficiently as possible, and so that was really lent itself to the customer support type model, right? You'd make an initial sale to a customer, that's where you'd realize the profit, and then really you try to spend as little as you could after that to keep customers happy. So there was kind of a reactive transactional type customer support relationship with customers. What happened then, though, was that mobile and cloud technology evolved. And, long story short, it became much easier and cheaper for vendors to develop solutions and deliver them to customers. So, whether it's an app or a software as a service platform, it was a lot easier than ever before for new vendors to enter the market with their own solutions. And as a result, the supply of products and solutions exceeded the demand. So it became a world where the buyer really was very much more in control because they had a lot more choice, and the cost of switching between different systems was substantially lower. So this is kind of the macro world shift that's happened over the last decade or so. And in this new world, the important thing for vendors to be thinking about is customer success. It's not the initial sale and then kind of stepping away from the relationship. It's how do we build an ongoing relationship with the customer where we are delivering value on an ongoing basis and demonstrating that value to the customer on an ongoing basis so that they keep giving us their money. So this shift to the model where products are bought increasingly as a service rather than as a one-off purchase is something that's been kind of labeled the subscription economy. And I don't know, about you, but I certainly now probably have more subscriptions than I care to mention to various pieces of software and technology, but also to other types of products, right? There's very few industries that are not being disrupted by this shift in the vendor-buyer relationship. So on the screen here, obviously we've got the cable companies and the streaming TV and entertainment type companies. We've got the bottom right there, subscription boxes. I don't know if any of you have ever used one of these services. I subscribe to one for my daughters where they get an engineering project through the mail every month. But even more, I think, interesting and impressive is things like furniture and cars are now available as a subscription, as a service. So from manufacturers like Porsche and Ford are now introducing subscription type models for their vehicles. And then even in the furniture business, there's a company here out of San Francisco where you designed for millennials, where you can rent your furniture for anything from 1 to 24 months, and you just give it back when you're done with it. So my point is that whether you're in a business that is 100% subscription, or whether maybe you've got a component of your business that is delivered as a subscription, or in fact, even if you're in a business that maybe at first you don't think is a subscription business, I think many of the concepts we're going to talk about today will still apply, right? If you're a retailer and you want to get repeat business from your customers, or you're a yoga therapist and you want to make sure your clients keep coming back again and again and again, it may not be a subscription billing model, but it is a relationship that you have to keep demonstrating value because you want them to come back and spend more money with you over time. So I think this is relevant for pretty much every business that's in operation today. Now, one of the interesting changes that's resulted from this shift in a sort of from vendor being the more powerful person in the relationship to the buyer having more control and more power, is that the vendors had to assume a substantial amount more risk, financial risk in the relationship. So now typically the vendor only gets a small percentage of the overall lifetime value of the customer upfront in the initial sale. And the majority of the revenue will come in the months and years after the sale happens. And so that's been a big shift. Essentially, the vendor is taking a gamble. They're floating the expense of the purchase. They're making a loan, if you like, for the buyer. And then really the emphasis is on them to demonstrate that their product can do what they said it can do, so that the customer will stay with them for as long as possible, and certainly long enough to recoup all that initial investment they made in acquiring the customer in the first place. Margaret, I think you had maybe a thought on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something where the risk has shifted, but vendors haven't exactly realigned their investment yet to align to that. So what we see are a lot of our customers that are still very focused on spending on the awareness and acquisition phase, and less so on the success of the customer with the product or service, which is what's required to get them to stay a customer. And so what happens is they get out of whack where they're spending a lot of money on the top of the funnel, but they're losing customers out at the bottom of the funnel even faster than they get them into the top, where what we want to talk about today is more around that retention phase of it, so that it makes sense that the customers that we're spending so much to get, we're actually keeping.
Yes, absolutely, great point. And I think as we go through this, that we'll talk more about ways to do that, right? How to keep those customers engaged and feeling like they're getting the value that they were promised as they move through their life cycle, as they move through their journey with you. Now, one of the kind of byproducts, I guess, of this macro shift is that customers now are much more thinking about the outcome that they're going to achieve, rather than the product or the service itself. And I think customers have always been more, ultimately as a customer you buy a product or you buy a service because you're trying to achieve an outcome. But I think as vendors, as people that are building products and services for customers, we need to now be thinking much more about what these outcomes are, because this is how customers are measuring us. This is how customers are deciding whether they made a good purchase or not, and whether they keep giving us money. They're not looking at the features and whether the features work the way you describe them, the way you describe them. They're looking at whether they're getting the business outcomes or the personal outcomes or the value that they thought they were going to get when they entered into the relationship. So, just to use a kind of time-tested analogy here, customers want a half-inch hole, right? They don't want a half-inch drill bit. You happen to be the drill bit. Your product or service happens to be the drill bit, right? This is the way that they're going to achieve the outcome they want. But at the end of the day, whether they're going to make a decision about whether to keep giving you money based on whether you've delivered the whole. The whole is what they're interested in. And then there's a second component of what we call customer success, which is the experience. I think with the advent of the new technologies around cloud and mobile, much more convenient, much easier to get things done, lower effort required to use products and also to switch between products. Buyers have just now got much higher expectations when it comes to the experience that they'll have. They expect an experience that is frictionless, right? That removes as much friction as possible. It makes it as easy as possible for them to get to the outcome they want. And ideally, they want to kind of enjoy it as well. Now, the level of enjoyment will vary, right? Not everybody wants to be kind of, some people just want a really low-touch experience, which is really simple, and then they're very happy with how it went. They're not looking for a lot of engagement and a lot of interaction. So, the experience has to be appropriate for the product or the service that you're selling, but they do look at how easy it is to get to their outcome they're looking for. So to take Uber and a conventional taxi as an example of this, both an Uber and a taxi will get you from A to B the same, right? The outcome is the same in both cases. But the experience in the case of an Uber is a lot less friction. There's a lot less friction in getting a taxi. The journey itself is more pleasant. The payment's more pleasant. They've removed friction. So even though the outcome is the same, the experience is a lot different. So really, customer success, when we talk about customer success with companies, we're looking both at the outcomes and the experience. Now, you can't provide a great experience without giving them the outcomes. The outcomes are the most important thing, but don't just deliver outcomes and forget to think about the experience, because you'll be vulnerable. If you do that, it just takes somebody else to come along and deliver the same outcome with better experience, and you'll lose that customer. And so talking about losing customers, if you fail with any of this, it's a lot easier now for customers to switch to a different provider, different platform, different vendor, different product, different service. It's a lot easier because the switching costs are lower and the switching effort is lower. So it's much more likely now that if you fail during delivery of whatever you've promised the customer, that it will result in the customer churning. And obviously, if they churn too early, the chances are you're not going to get back that money that you floated them to get them on board in the first place, and you end up basically just burning cash. And you put a customer, an unhappy customer, out into the world who's going to go and tell people about their experience and the outcomes that they failed to get with your product or service. So it's critical that you deliver on what you promise during the sales and marketing stage of the life cycle. I just want to share this quote, which I kind of like. Success is never owned; it's rented, and the rent is due every day. And I think some people get in. If you're in maybe in a business where there's some sort of contract cycle, maybe an annual cycle for a contract, I think people get into the trap of thinking about this only once a year, maybe a couple of months before renewal. Suddenly you think, oh gosh, have I delivered value? I better do some value now, so the customer renews. Well, the customer's not thinking about this once a year. They're thinking about it every day. They are making micro judgments about your product or service every time they use your product and every time they interact with your brand. And so you need to think about this as an ongoing process that you need to develop a muscle around within your company. This needs to be something that happens continuously. It needs to be ideally put into some form of structured process so that you can deliver it repeatedly and you can deliver it as you scale. And I've talked a lot about the downsides or the risks to the vendor now that this power balance has kind of shifted more to the buyer. But there is some upside as well, which is if you get it right, then the positive impact is significant as well, right? Because we know that prospective buyers, these buyers in your sales funnel, are increasingly looking for input from existing or past customers of yours before they make a purchase decision. And so if you can get this right and develop customer advocates, then that will reduce the cost of your initial acquisition, right? It'll reduce the cost of getting leads. It'll accelerate the progress of leads through the sales cycle. It'll reduce the overall cost of acquisition. And therefore, that reduces some of that upfront financial risk that you take as a vendor. So, there's definitely a reward as well for getting this right. It's not all about risk avoidance. It's also, there's a tremendous benefit if you can get it right. So that kind of brings us now to onboarding and what we're, our focus of today, which is what happens in that kind of first period of the life cycle after they buy your product or they sign a contract with you. Traditionally, it's called onboarding. It may be when they're getting trained and set up on your software, or it may be when they're waiting for delivery of a product they've ordered. Whatever it might be, this point is a point of very high leverage in terms of the customer relationship. If you get it right, do it well, you set yourself up, you give yourself a high chance of delivering success for your customer, right? Your chances of customer success in the long run are significantly improved. However, if you get it wrong at this point, it's extremely hard to recover. It's really, really tough to correct a bad experience or some bad delivery that happens at this point. So, if you're going to focus somewhere along this customer life cycle, the onboarding piece, even though it may be a relatively short period of time, is the place that I always recommend you start, because you need to make sure you get this right before you move on to the rest of the life cycle. And in terms of why it's a high risk point of the journey, is that there's typically a few things that are happening, a few dynamics in play at the point the customer becomes a customer, right? The point they make the purchase or sign a contract. So, for example, in a kind of B2B environment where maybe they've been dealing with a sales executive up in the sales cycle and now they sign a contract, they get handed over to a delivery team, right? Whether it's operations or customer success or onboarding, there's some form of transition of relationship. And that always creates risk, right? That emotional connection they formed with your company and a person in your company is now broken and has to be kind of bone, it's kind of broken, it has to be reset. And so you need to make sure you reset that right so that it is strong and it sets them up for success. Another reason it's kind of risky is that this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where your promises have to turn into reality, right? This is where everything you've told them about how all this value you can create in the sales and marketing cycle now has to translate to actual value. So that's, and it has to do it fast because the buyer is looking for validation that they've made the right decision. And they're particularly vulnerable to this because they've just signed a big check or paid a lot of money. So there's an element of buyer's remorse going on, and they're looking for a quick demonstration that they've made the right decision. They're looking to get to first value as quickly as possible, and that will then, again, set you up for longer term success. And then the last reason is that typically in a lot of companies, the teams that are responsible for acquisition often have software that they use to manage their day and their prospects. And then the team that manages delivery often operates in a different system that's designed more specialized for their needs. And what we tend to see is that data gets trapped in silos, right? It doesn't get past in a granular enough level from the sales to the retention piece of the business. And so you lose information that you've learned about the customer already, and you have to ask them again, or you fail to have the ability to act on that information because it's not in the right place. So these are some of the risks, and I hope I've kind of highlighted why onboarding is such a critical part of the customer life cycle. And I'd like to pass it back to Karen now. I think she's got a poll that we're going to run.
Yes, thank you so much, James. That was a lot of great information. And the audience, we're going to take a turn and ask you a question right now before we segue over to Margaret's part of the presentation. So here's our question for you. We want to know about your own efforts at onboarding. So the question is, how would you rate your organization's onboarding effectiveness? You have three choices, and we're asking you to choose one. Is it very effective? Does it maybe need some attention? Or maybe it's non-existent and you need some help, and certainly that is why you are here with us today. So think about that for a couple of seconds while I also remind everyone that we will have time for some audience Q&A after Margaret's formal remarks. So if you have some questions for James or Margaret, please get them in. Go ahead and submit them through the Q&A box. I also want to mention that we are recording this webinar today because there is a lot of great information, and maybe you don't have time to take down all the notes you want, so it will be available on demand, and I'm going to send an email out later, and then you can watch it again at your leisure. So let's take a look at the results. All right, so Margaret, I'm going to bring you in to look at these results with me. So we have a few people who feel they have a very effective onboarding process, but for the most part, everybody's onboarding needs some attention, and that would certainly explain why they're attending the webinar today.
Thanks, Karen. Those are the results that we kind of expected to see, although I really like seeing that we've got almost 15% of the audience that have very effective onboarding. A lot of times, as we said in the title of this, it is the kind of the missing stage, the journey within the journey, that gets underfunded and overlooked. So we're going to talk a little bit about that now and get a little specific about how organizations can kind of assess where they are and where they might surface some opportunities for improvement in this. And I'd like to always encourage the customers that we work with to think about the wow moments. And we're going to talk in a minute about a couple of exercises that you can do to think about where those wow moments are. But we're pointing out here the difference between a smiley face and a big smiley face. And I'll take us back in time to think about when raving fan was a very popular concept. And it's, again, as James was detailing, it's even more important now because the churn rates are higher. Consumption type business, whether that's B2C or B2B, companies are moving more to a pay-as-you-go, pay-for-what-you-use model. And we're even starting to see the concepts around this of moving from NPS, Net Promoter Score, which is the concept where you ask your customer to give you feedback on a one question, 1 to 10 scale, how likely are they to recommend you, to the idea of customer ease or ease of doing business. And this is still very simple, but a little bit more complex around what's the emotional effort to do business with your company, what's the physical effort to do business with your company, and what's the time effort to do business with your company. And those are the components that can really make the difference from saying, yeah, they're good, to, oh my gosh, they are fantastic. And that's really when you think about embracing and taking advantage of those wow moments, is how you move your customers from saying, yeah, they're good, they're fine, I recommend, I would use them, to, oh my gosh, you really have to check out this company and this amazing experience that we have. So as you think about, all right, how do we figure out what those moments are? The first bit of homework that I like to give is to put yourself in the shoes of your customer. And we sit so many times in conference rooms thinking about the customer journey and the different personas, what are they going through. And there's two things that I'll say. One is pick up the phone and call your customer. Ask them. Do some voice of the customer. But the other thing that you can do very easily, you can do tomorrow, is to go through that process of how would someone find out about your company, and how would they get more information about you? Would they click? Would they call? Would they send an email? Would they do a web chat? How long would it take for them to be responded to? And what would that process be if they want more information? As we think about the power moving to the buyer from the seller, consumers don't want so much information to be gated. They want more self-service opportunity there. So have you made it easy for them to find out more and get more information about your product or service? And then as we highlight the onboarding piece, how difficult is it for somebody to do business with you? Are there tons of contracts that have to be signed? Do they have to go through a process of, signing and scanning and returning? Or do you have an easy e-signature process for them to go through? Do you appreciate their business and recognize their business, and that you're honored to have earned their business and will continue to earn their business over time? There are ways that you can acknowledge and express some appreciation to that, and we'll talk a little bit about the black hole in a minute. So it's continuing that sense of urgency from the time that they commit to buying from you as they get into the initial use of your product or service. And you think about your communications with them at that point through that onboarding and initial usage, that it's value communication versus what we see a little more commonly is as soon as they buy something from you, you send them another message, another email. You ready to buy something else? You ready for your next order? You want to buy more? Instead of helping to do some things like set expectations and provide some value communications in that process. The next step, the next piece of homework that I give our customers is to say, now let's flip that process over. We first went through the processes of what does it feel like to be a customer. Now let's flip that over and think about what does it feel like to be a piece of data moving through the organization. So again, if we rewind in that process and say, how does someone first connect with your company? Are they sending a contact me form over the website? Are they calling a phone number and leaving a message? Who picks that up, and where does that data go? Is it coming across as an email to somebody? And then at what point does that email get into a system where it's tracked, and what's the lag of that process? So how many times is that data getting entered that's redundant, which is an opportunity for error? Or is it automated? Are there workflow rules around that to ensure that it's getting directed to the right person? Are there workflow rules around that ensure that it's being responded to on a timely basis or else being escalated? Are you responding to that and with value information along the process, and is that being tracked? Or is it the old traditional example we love to give of, you call your cable company and you have to put in your phone number and your account number and you go through the IVR for 5 steps and then you get on the phone with an actual person who takes you through everything all over again, right? You want to think about how can you avoid that experience for your customer. So that leads us to think about the foundational systems and eliminating those data silos, as James referenced earlier, as one of the obstacles to creating a good onboarding experience. A lot of companies, again, they are investing in that acquisition side of the equation, so they may have good connection to their website or email marketing system and their CRM, but there's often a big disconnect of, well, once they become a customer, and how does that information get into the ERP system, and how does that flow well? And another piece of homework or poll question even that I like to give to a group is to say, when do you consider somebody to be a customer? That seems like a really obvious kind of question. But the answers really vary, and they vary within an organization. Some companies will say, well, it's when we get a PO from them. Others will say it's not till the first order ships. Others will say it's not till we issue an invoice. Some people will put somebody into their ERP system as a customer once a credit has been approved and extended. So there's a lot of different definitions around that, and really identifying and shoring that up internally is an important piece to having the right foundation to create a smooth onboarding experience. When we go through these exercises of be your customer, be a piece of data, think about how data is flowing through your systems in the integration, we like to use this template of journey mapping. And we break those experiences down between people, process, data, technology, content, and we align them to the moments across these stages. And if we circle back to, that's where we can often identify not just where things might be falling through the cracks, but also where we have the opportunity to create those wow moments and really surprise and delight. And another area that you can think about doing this is where we've circled here across this retain and convert, retain, and advocate is the second kind of piece of this missing onboarding step of the journey is a lot of customers, and I wish we had time to do a secondary poll, which would be we do maybe, as we saw, we had almost 15% people that do a good job of the onboarding experience. We have 80% that say they really need to put more attention to it. But again, around this recognizing and appreciate your customer's business is thinking about when somebody goes through the secondary onboarding stage as well, which is to say when they do renew a contract or when they go to a second buy or you've cross-sold and upsold or they are leveraging a second line of business, is to think about the onboarding journey for that additional business. You don't want to necessarily treat them exactly the way you treat a brand new customer in the onboarding process, but you really want to recognize their loyalty to you. So you can think through that process as well as to say, are we showing the right kind of appreciation here? Very simple example. Again, I'll use cable because we all love to pick on cable companies and their terrible customer service ratings. But we think about the James image of the goldfish bowl and the goldfish jumping into the other bowl. I think cable is a great example of this churn that we see is people will sign up because they get a great promotional rate for 6 months or 12 months. And the cable companies are kind of notorious for all of a sudden on month 13 you get your bill is jacked back up really high again, and then the customer is surprised by it, and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it, just all of a sudden our bill is so much higher. And so they immediately go out and look for a better rate again, and that ends up being the competitor, so they call and they get switched back over. That would have been a good opportunity for any business to recognize that somebody is at the end of their natural contract. Again, as James pointed out, not wait until the 30 days prior, but be queuing up for that all along, and maybe offer some renewal promotion. It doesn't always even necessarily need to be price incentive, but just something that recognizes and gets ahead of that unpleasant surprise in the process. So as we go through this framework and map this out, it gives gives teams a really great opportunity to look and think about within this framework where are some opportunities, again, to eliminate things falling through the cracks, but also create some of those wow moments. I think this is kind of another great illustration of what happens internally as you go from sales to delivery is, if you think about what that customer experience feels like, is there's a huge sense of urgency from the sales team. Buy, sign. I want to get them to become a customer. I want to get through all of these steps. Usually the sales process is 2 steps ahead of the buying process, which could be a whole other webinar on its own. And then it just comes to almost a screeching halt internally while the delivery team catches up to that, whatever that lag in process is, to deliver. There's usually some stop break point in there where things are happening on the company, on the delivery side, but the customer doesn't always have visibility to that, so they're just kind of sitting there waiting and not always knowing what's going on. So I'll give a bit of a personal illustration of this process that I recently went through. And this is a consumer experience, but you can think a lot about similarly how this can apply in a B2B environment. But bought a sofa over the holidays. La-Z-Boy was having a great promotion and took advantage of that. And, really excited. We've just been redoing our basement, so we order the sofas, and they tell us, okay, it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks until your sofa comes in. And we've, been out to La-Z-Boy to see it a couple of times, and, pretty excited about getting the sofas, and the kids have tried them out and all of that. So it's kind of the last piece to be able to use our new renovated basement. So, whip out the credit card, pay for it, and they're just like, okay, thanks. 4 to 6 weeks and your sofa will be here. And then radio silence. And so I felt like I was just kind of in this black hole of, now what? I don't know, are you going to call me? Are you going to email me? Do I have any idea what's going on? How do I plan for this? I'm going to be, out of town some, So it was just nothing. And the salesperson, said thanks for the order. But then I really had no insight as to what was going to happen next. And that's really, where we spend a lot of time thinking about this process with our customers is around onboarding specifically of how do we bridge that gap. If we, think back to the salesperson's really excited, they got it, the contract is signed, and then there are all these things that are happening internally in an organization, that there's internal transition going on, there are resources being assigned to a project, or it's going through a process of getting ordered or getting manufactured. And what happens and when does that happen? And that's that opportunity for those value communications as soon as someone becomes a customer. And so as we think about what's happening and are we preparing our customer for the use of that product or service, or their things that we can be sharing during that time frame that help them prepare, help them get their teams ready, their systems ready, get their basement ready to receive the sofas, and think about that. So that's part of where we surface up in that journey mapping process to think through how do we bridge the gap during that time frame. And James, I don't know if you want to add a little bit to that as well from your perspective.
Yeah, I would just add that, one thing that I'd encourage folks listening to this call to think about is, how well do I understand the reason that the person, this buyer is buying the sofa in this case, right? What is the outcome they're looking to achieve? Again, back to my original point, there's a reason they're buying your product or your service. So in this case, Margaret, this is a sofa that you're going to put in a refurbished basement, and I don't know if that's where guests stay or where the kids play or whatever it might be, right? There's some sort of use case that you have. Whereas you might have another customer that buys the same sofa and they intend that to be, they've got a studio apartment and this is their bed every night. And so understanding that outcome, right, well, how's the customer ultimately going to use the product, and how are they going to judge, make an assessment weeks, months down the line as to whether it was a good purchase, can help you then deliver a better experience, right? So you might tailor your email communications differently. You might, if they use it every day, you might check back in 6 months and offer them some other product that's better, maybe some sofa cleaning solution, or some sort of product or service that is suited to the use case that they have for the product. So I just encourage, typically that information often comes up during a sales conversation. But again, back to the kind of the silos, that data might get just captured in a sales CRM, maybe it's unstructured data, where it then kind of just it becomes trapped and it can't be used. So think about, if we're capturing that information or asking those questions as part of our sales cycle, let's capture it in a way that's structured so that data can then be passed on and used in clever, innovative ways to improve the experience later on down the life cycle.
That's a perfect point that leads great into this slide, is to think about if we reimagined that experience and what La-Z-Boy could have been communicating to us during the process to help us build some anticipation. You're absolutely right. We were very clear in the process of selecting our sofas to say, hey, this is a basement where our kids and their teenage friends are all going to be hanging out. We want something that's durable. And they could have captured that. But even without knowing that, there's a lot they could have done in the process here in this 4 to 6 weeks in between, which could be some things like letting us know on track for scheduling. You're being manufactured right now, and as a matter of fact, here is a picture of the construction of your sofa, and that would give me an opportunity to see the durable materials that are being used, or the team that's focused on it. So then I start to build a little more loyalty to this brand, where I feel more aligned to the brand and say, oh, anytime I need furniture, I want to go get it from La-Z-Boy, instead of saying, yeah, it's a pretty good sofa. So thinking back to that difference between saying, yeah, we got a good deal, it's a nice sofa, to, oh, I would go there anytime I'm redoing something in my house. I would do, they could be sending me things about color trends for the year. If they knew I was using this, for guests, it could be sending me things about pillows and, various types of things that could help build some anticipation and preparation for receiving the product that I had ordered. And again, to your point of coming back and anticipating what some future needs might be, as they captured in this process, we did give them, again, a lot of information about what we were doing, and that there was other furniture that we do need for the basement. It would be great to imagine that, hey, I'm going to get something that's going to be very targeted to me in the next 30 to 60 days that's going to draw me back into their process, back into the store, because they've anticipated, okay, now you got your sofas in and you mentioned that you need a coffee table as well or that you wanted to get a rug. We sent you, here's the color trends for 2018, and then drop me into a persona that would give me some targeted communications and encourage me to come back. So in wrapping up, as we think about these opportunities with the clients, again, it's creating an environment and opportunities to drive advocacy. So giving some channels for that, sending me some information that's easy for me to share. So here's a picture of your sofa, Margaret, that you ordered, and share this on Facebook with your friends or share this on house.com. That kind of gets us into thinking about user-generated content, which is rated much more valuable than vendor information online. And in B2B environments, we can think about things like going back to our customers and asking for some very specific referrals. Do you think the product or service that we've provided to you would also be helpful to any of your peers? Another channel that I'm really a fan of, and I think James has done some great work around this, is creating some online community. Again, fostering those valued connections among peers and among your customers that they do the selling for you. And another great avenue to do that is around creating some events or sponsoring events where you have the opportunity to bring customers together and let them advocate amongst themselves. Are great opportunities for businesses to really leverage, take advantage of that leverage point where they've done a good job in that onboarding, and then create opportunities for their customers to share and actually be fans. So again, as we think about this, creating brand advocates for life and creating those channels together. And speaking of the channels, again, SuccessHACKER has a fantastic online community, customersuccess.community, and if you have any questions, you can contact James about that, and he will provide some more information and get you connected. James, I'd like to really thank you for your time and context and information today. That was really valuable. And if anyone on the call would like a copy of the presentation and specifically the journey mapping framework, template, and workbook that we have, my contact information, mwise@arke.com. We're happy to share that with you as well. And Karen, I will pass over to you to take and ask some questions now.
Great. Thanks so much, Margaret. That was an awful lot of great information. I loved hearing your personal experience. I mean, so many times we think of ourselves as marketers and business people, and we forget that we're all consumers too. So we can sort of see how we're treated, and it sort of helps us spotlight things that we could be doing and our companies could be doing better as well. So really interesting stuff. So we do have a few questions coming in. So I want to remind the audience that keep them coming. We've got some time now. We're going to get started with James and Margaret on some of the questions we've got from our audience members. A lot of great information that they've given us today. So let's take a look at this. Start kind of broad here. So the question is, what steps would you suggest to an organization to ensure more effective onboarding and retaining customers? So Margaret, you sort of showed some of the steps that you thought Lazy Boy could have taken with you. How about in a more general sense, maybe you could start us off here of what are some of the things, processes that vendors can build into their onboarding process?
Absolutely. I think going back to the exercise of mapping out what that current process looks like, and then thinking about doing an exercise of, if we started from the beginning, how would we design this experience to be? So thinking not about any of the constraints that you currently have, but thinking about, again, if we could design the absolute optimal onboarding experience, what would that look and feel like? And then within organizations, looking for some greenfield opportunity to do that. So it may be, if they're introducing a new product or service, that might be a test bed for that newly designed experience, or maybe taking a small percentage of customers, of new customers, or one persona, and looking at, even though it may be more manual to start with that sample group, before they automate it, kind of testing it out and making sure that works. But, looking for some way to create a small sample set to test out a new process, a new experience, and then implement that across the organization.
James, anything you'd like to add there? Some steps you can think of?
Yeah, there is one thing actually. One kind of common theme that I often encounter when talking to a company for the first time is that they haven't really set up much in the way of a voice of the customer program. Margaret touched on this earlier, but just in its simplest form, that just means setting up ways to listen to what your customers think of what you're doing, right? Of how you're working, because customers are our biggest source of data on how good our customer experience is. So we need to think of ways that we can set up listening posts at various points of the onboarding cycle and actively solicit the feedback from them. And it may be that we do more of this, more intensely for a period of time, just while we gather enough information to help us kind of set priorities, and then maybe we throttle things back. We've got to be careful not to detract from the customer experience. But every customer suggestion or complaint is a piece of, it's like gold dust. It can do so much for your organization, and looking for themes within that data can really help you focus on the areas that you can make the biggest impact by spending a little bit of energy. So I just encourage people to think about how easy is it for a customer to give you feedback on the experience that they're having.
All right, good. We've got some questions coming in now. Everybody wants to get them answered before we run out of time. So here's the next one. James, I'm going to stick with you on this, and it's a very interesting question. What do you do if the customer's expectations do not match what can actually be delivered? You want to start with that, James, and then we'll give Margaret a couple of seconds to think about her response.
What a great question. I like that one. Yeah. So, I think I would ask where are customers getting their expectations from, first of all, and at some point, if this is the case, right, at some point you are going to disappoint the customer. You are going to fail to meet their expectations, and I believe strongly that you should do that as soon as possible, right? So, if customer expectations are misaligned for a particular customer, and you can't meet them, don't kind of, push it to one side and think I'll deal with that later when it becomes, when they realize that we can't meet that date or that expectation. Have that conversation up front and give them the bad news early. They may be unhappy, but have something, have some little remedy in your back pocket, maybe some sort of good faith gesture to kind of show them that you care, but, you wanted to make sure that they understood what was realistic. So that's in the case of a specific customer. If this is happening more generally across your whole customer base, then I think there's a communication opportunity there to better communicate and set expectations, and that starts from your marketing team. Right? You are starting to set these expectations from your first contact with a prospective customer, all the way through the marketing cycle and all the way through the sales cycle. All the messaging, all those interactions are opportunities to set expectations. And so the chances are that somewhere along that journey, expectations have been set incorrectly, and there's some work that needs to be done to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success and not setting yourself up for failure. That's a great question.
It is a good question.
Go ahead, Margaret.
I was just going to say it's a common challenge because every business, large and small, is competing against the expectations that are being set by Amazon, by Domino's Pizza, by Delta, that are just so far out there and represent, a sliver of all business that's being done, but every consumer experience every time it's good, it just raises the bar, and it is hard for other companies to be able to keep up with it. But I agree 100% with James. It really comes down to setting expectations, and most disappointment is tied to surprises. So when you can eliminate that and set those expectations early in the process, it may not be necessarily what they want to hear, but at least knowledge is power.
All right, let's see if we can squeeze one more question in here. Clearly, we've been talking all about onboarding, but there are sometimes other issues maybe that come up for service companies. So let's look at this question. And Margaret, I'm going to let you start with it. The onboarding journey obviously gets overlooked by many brands, but what are other problem areas that you've seen that could cause customer churn?
I'd love to do a webinar on every stage of the journey because there are opportunities and misses within each of them. I think the one that I would say maybe that happens as well is around the renewal. And James touched on this. So whether that's a renewal of a contract or whether that's, when someone has finished, anticipating their consumption of a product or service, I think it's just missing the whole opportunity around that. So, thinking about the voice of the customer, why someone's buying from you, their outcome. Did they buy from you because they're value conscious, or is it price or is it quality? But just anticipating when they're going to be ready to buy something else and getting ahead of that process. So depending, again, what the outcomes are of why and how they're purchasing from you, and understanding that and following up when it's appropriate. So not too early in the process and not too aggressively in the process, but also not waiting too late and too long. So it's a fine line in there, but when companies can master that, they have great opportunity.
James, anything you want to add?
Squeeze in a little bit more? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So there are multiple parts to the process of delivering value, and I think number one is understanding what value is important to that particular customer. This is on a customer by customer basis, and we've talked about that a number of times already today. Number two is delivering the value, which is also hard and very important. But the third part, but a part that often gets neglected, is the demonstration of the value. And I don't know if any of you have been in this situation. I certainly have, where a customer who's a great fit for the solution I was selling, who I know is getting a ton of value from it, and there's nothing else on the market that would deliver anything near to the value that we're providing, but they still churn because they didn't understand the value they were getting. And that was a failure on my part for not doing a good enough job of demonstrating it to them. So think about how you can articulate the value, not just to your end, the specific customer that you've been dealing with, or the specific end user of your software, if you're selling software, but also, if they're having to go and get kind of approval and budget from other people, think of ways you can articulate the value in a format that they can then share internally and like tell your story. They can be your champion. They can share that internally with other people, so that you don't get a CFO or CEO kind of, cutting off the contract because they've asked the user to articulate the value, and your customer has been unable to do it on their own. So that's, I think the demonstration of value is a great opportunity.
All right, great. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. I want to thank James and Margaret for a very informative and timely presentation, and I want to thank our audience for your great questions. We didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but don't worry, we will pass them along to our friends at Arke for follow-up. I do want to give a special thank you to the folks at Arke, who is our sponsor today, and you can visit them, as you see here, at www.arke.com. That's all for our broadcast today. We look forward to seeing you next time, right here at Digital Marketing Depot.